I think he is a symbol for upholding the dignity of every person.
He was doing what he was called to do.
So he took on a significant sacrifice, family, church, society, all these levels, to say what needed to be said. And so that's why we see him as a prophet.
Certainly our dad stood strong in his belief, in his knowledge. What could be clearer than thou shalt not kill?
He was born in the late 1800s and died in 1932. He was a very strong, active Catholic.
You know, he lived in Denver. He lived at on Knox Court. He was married here at Holy Family. He practiced the faith here at Holy Family. He brought his kids up to be good Catholics, and a sister, a nun, and a priest in the family, and a woman who married and had a good marriage and had kids and was a devoted mother.
My mother never spoke a word about what our dad had been doing. She herself was, I'm sure, persecuted, you know, the whole family, and no one understood a conscientious objector. In those days, that was just unheard of, or they were just deemed a little off their senses.
His behavior as a lay person was effective in the sense that he would organize around social issues. His faith was very much the foundation of his behavior, and it really had a deep influence and expression with his life.
The Ludlow massacre was just a big event in his life. It was a tragic event for those forces to come out and just literally kill the wives and children. It was just really a terrible, terrible event in his life.
He was outraged by the fact that the federal government and Pinkertons had come down upon the miners and shot through their tents and killed more than a couple of dozen of people, women and children in their tents. And this was a cause of great controversy nationwide.
The massacre was, I think, what probably precipitated him thinking and really going inside of himself and figuring out what he thought about that. And I think that was probably the initiation into his whole war resistance and conscientious objection.
When he got the draft notice in June of 1917, he went and registered for the draft, but immediately sent a letter to President Wilson saying that he would not be complying with further orders from the military.
Because Ben put his thinking and his convictions into writing, they were easily tracked. You know, it wasn't hearsay. I mean, they had a flyer that he wrote, or an article that he wrote, or a speech that he gave, you know, that had his opinions in it. So it wasn't like the press needed to fabricate anything. It was right there. But again, it was at a time when those values were not popular, and what he was saying was contrary to the way most people felt and believed.
He was denounced in the papers, Denver Post, for being a slacker. And the New York Times even got a hold of the story, and on November 6th of 1917, they wrote of Denver's notorious slacker.
When he received the notice that he could appear at the draft, he went and told him he would not cooperate and returned home, and they sent police to his home to arrest him and take him in for incarceration.
And so we hired a lawyer, and in March of 1918, he brought a claim against the government on religious freedom grounds. And he said that my First Amendment rights to religious freedom are being violated because I believe that Christ commands me not to kill, and the government is commanding me to kill, and I have the right to refuse. So it was really interesting that he was ready to take this to court, and but before proceedings got very far, he was rearrested in May of 1918, and he was sent up to Fort Logan, not far from where I live, about a mile from where I live, to spend his first night in military confinement, and from there shipped out to Kansas, and his little itinerary through the military installations of the West.
He could have taken a desk job in some general's office or whatever, but no, he didn't want to do anything that would contribute to the war in any way.
The basic thing on which he took his stand was the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And anything in regard to the military, that's a killing. Whether you're directly or indirectly involved with the military, as he saw it, you're participating in evil, and he was not willing to do that. That was a violation of his conscience.
He wrote some scathing letters to President Wilson and just renounced anything to do with the war. It was just odious to him. He felt it was manipulation by the big businesses, that it was just, well, he called it the war machine.
So at this particular time, World War I, when the head of the Catholic bishops in this country gave total approval to United States entering into the war, and this Cardinal Gibbons said that we would participate with our collaboration with the decision that the President Wilson had made.
Overall, I would say that the just war theory is an attempt by the church to say that we have to do everything we can to protect human life, and that we have to defend populations from unjust aggression.
Most Catholics in most countries during the Great War supported them. Ironically, it was Catholics in the United States that supported the just war theory in this instance of the war, and Catholics in the UK, in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain did as well, and in France as well, and Germany as well, and Austria as well, so that on all sides Catholics were able to appeal to this just war tradition to justify their own nation going to war.
Unfortunately, he was incarcerated by the military. He was under the power and control of the military, and he was never part of the military. So there's a grave inconsistency there right away. And then his fasting was a significant part too.
I guess he was on that hunger strike for 133 days. I just flipped when I saw that.
They were afraid that he was going to die, while he was in jail and while he was incarcerated. So they force-fed him, to keep him alive.
In those days, tube feeding was, they took a porcelain funnel and put it down as far as they could in somebody's throat and poured milk and eggs down it and held his nose so he'd have to swallow.
While he was in prison, there's chaplains that come to the prison, and the Catholic chaplains that would visit him would not hear his confession, would not give him communion. And that is a very, very rare situation, and it's contrary to what we are trained to do as priests.
He writes in prison too at Leavenworth about people being hung, and that all the inmates were forced to witness this hanging. It's a terrifying time.
They finally assigned him to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. They wanted to pronounce him. They tried all those years to break him, really. And there he was, landed in St. Elizabeth's Hospital after his hunger strike. So they committed him to St. Elizabeth's Sane Asylum. He got a kick out of, he said, well, that says a lot for our government, doesn't it, to put a conscientious objector with, demented people that had been committed for really crimes. But he then continued that hunger strike. And it tells in the book, because of his hunger strike, he was finally released along with 30 plus other conscientious objectors, and this was 2 years after the war had completed.
But for me, what's inspiring is what the conviction was. And the conviction was, I believe in the gospel, and I'm going to live the gospel, and I'm going to live that out.
Ben Salmon preached the gospel of the nonviolent Christ. If only Christians 100 years ago during World War I were willing to do as Ben Salmon did, to follow the nonviolent Jesus Christ, millions of people would have been saved.
But he was a rare person to take this stand in World War I, and because of his perseverance, because of his faith-based decision, that this is something that needs to be said to the world. Ben Salmon's message is not in any way limited to a locality. It is the message of God, it's the message of the church, and that's what we use canonization, that when we say this person is a holy person and is to be set up as an example, a model of holiness, who will express their faith at any price.
Here was a basic, normal, ordinary guy from a local parish, like I said, a mile away, who heard the gospel, who read the newspapers, who thought about justice, and who said, I'm not going to comply with this rush to war. This is going to be a manslaughter. He saw through all the rhetoric about the war to end all wars and so on.
He stayed with his convictions. He believed it so deeply that he suffered through all of these things, and he even missed the birth of his first son, Charles.
I think that people like Ben can invite us to regroup and to re-establish our relationship with God and one another, and our appreciation of the fact that we're not made to be at war with one another.